All right, I think, are ready to get started with our webinar. So I'm going to hand it off to Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining wherever you are across the globe. Today's presentation addresses COVID-19's impact on the APAC region with a focus on Japan and Australia. Just to clarify, the presentation itself will include an overview of Japan and Australia, as well as a general overview of APAC. And we will finish off with a Q&A session, so please feel free to ask questions throughout. And in addition, we'll have several polls which will be presented through the Zoom platform, and you'll be able to respond to those as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass it on. Our presenters today are Alicia Kapoor, who is lead travel and retail consultant, and Jamie Drayton, our lead financial services and e-commerce consultant. So take it away, Jamie.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So as Daniel mentioned, we'll start off with an overview of APAC. We'll then go into an Australia deep dive, covering a few special markets, right? What's happening across different categories. And then we'll finish up with a Japan deep dive where Alicia will take over. Great, so before we get started, I just wanted to highlight the ways in which Similarweb is currently covering coronavirus and how you can find out more information about your industry and your country. So the first place to go would be our Insights Hub, which can be found at the URL at the top, so similarweb.com/coronavirus. And on that site, you'll find that we have everything of tracking of every major category across different markets. So it's a great place to go to understand what's happening with your category in real time as coronavirus progresses around the world, as well as look at the content that we've already published on different categories and regions. Also on that microsite, you'll be able to sign up for our email digest. So that's a great way to get 1 to 2 emails a week on what's happening across these industries, what are the new trends that we're seeing, what to look out for. And then finally, social media. So Alicia and I are both very active on LinkedIn, as is Similarweb and a lot of our colleagues. So it's always good to follow us and respond there if you have any questions. Great, so before we get into the data, it's important to make sure that everyone understands exactly how we collect the data that we're talking about. So to just speak to our methodology, right, it's really 3 steps. And the first is this data collection process. So across hundreds of diverse data sources, including panel, anonymous behavioral data, right? All of this data is gathered across desktop, mobile web, and app, so both iOS and Android. And the second step of data processing is really what I think makes Similarweb's offer unique. So what we have is direct data. So a lot of sites will upload their Google or Adobe Analytics directly to us, about 1 million sites. And with that data, we're able to calibrate what we're seeing across traffic across the entire internet, right? So this is why we're able to give such great coverage across pretty much every site on the internet. It's because we have this direct data that we measure against all of our data sources in order to understand what the general trend is, right? And the real value here of what you'll see when we're going through different categories is that whether your direct visits may be slightly different than the way that we're doing the calculation, what's important is that we're measuring every site the exact same way so that when we're seeing a trend across an industry, we know that that's what's really occurring. So we'll walk through some examples of that. And then finally, it's how this data is delivered to you. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today is through our purchase intelligence or market intelligence platform. So that's Similarweb Pro if you're already a user, but we also service a lot of other industries such as sales and investors. Great, so why Similarweb? What are the big things that, again, make us unique? So the big thing that I think is important to cover is this global coverage. Alicia and I are both North America based, so it's the evening for us, but good morning, afternoon to most people on the call. But it really speaks to the coverage of regions and industries that we have, right? So APAC, that's what we'll be going through today, but a lot of data in Europe, North America, Central America as well. The next piece is all platforms. So the ability to understand everything that a consumer is doing, right? From desktop, mobile web, and then mobile app being both Android and iOS. The next big thing is how actionable the insights that you find are. So while it's helpful to look at this information, what really matters is how quickly can you turn that into something that makes a difference for your business. And whether you're looking at the top keywords, right, to understand what are the new trends of what consumers are searching for, or benchmarking against competition, it's really very clear what those steps are that you can take. And I think that plays in well to this last piece, which is the speed to insight, right? So the idea should be that you can go on, understand quickly what's happening, and have that great piece to take back to your organization of, this is the trend that we're seeing, this is how we need to respond. So we'll start off with an APAC overview, and for that, I'll hand it over to Alicia.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. So we are going to start off with an APAC overview, as Jamie said, and I wanted to start off with a timeline of coronavirus as it pertains to APAC. Obviously, this is not comprehensive, but I think it gives us a good idea of what the landscape has looked like over the past 4 months, which is the crazy part. I think that we sometimes forget that everything that has happened in the past 4 months, like I said, has happened really, really quickly and just kind of overwhelmed the world in a way that we've probably never seen before. Some important dates to note here with regards to Australia and Japan. On March 24th, Australia's Prime Minister told all residents to stay home. And then the three important Japan dates here would obviously be the February date with regards to the Diamond Princess cruise ship, but also more recently on April 16th, Japan implemented a nationwide state of emergency, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And this was after there were a few state of emergencies in different cities. And then on April 24th, unfortunately, Hokkaido had to reinstate lockdowns after having an uptick in cases after lifting lockdowns. So Japan is definitely kind of in the thick of it. It's going to be really interesting to see what the next few months look like for APAC in general. But again, this timeline has just been kind of just very, very intense and very, very quick. So looking at overall global trends, we wanted to start off by looking at global travel platforms because travel has probably been the industry that has been the most affected by coronavirus. And this graph over here is mapping each country on a time horizon relative to when each country hit the 20 case mark. So we wanted to do that to level the playing field and just equalize the trends for countries to really see what's happening if you were to compare apples to apples. And what we're seeing here is that US and EMEA have had probably the most severe impacts with regards to travel. They have had declines much quicker and much more steep than other areas. And we're starting to see that Japan and other countries in Southeast Asia, which have so far been outliers in terms of pace of case accumulation, are now taking a sharp upward turn, or a downward turn. So as a result, or cases are taking an upward turn, travel is going to start taking a downward turn. And we're starting to see that travel is succumbing to some of the severity that is associated with the accumulation of cases. And then in Australia, we're kind of seeing that Australia is in the middle of the pack. It hasn't been affected as severely. It's kind of leveling out. And I think that that's going to be a theme throughout, is just looking at how, especially in Japan and Australia, the effects have been very different from almost the rest of the world, I would say. And something to look at, another area to look at is global grocery delivery. And this industry, as I'm sure you all know, has experienced exponential growth worldwide. But like global travel platforms, it's been impacted in different regions in different ways. So there was definitely an initial peak, especially in US and EMEA. And we can kind of attribute that to people figuring out how to adjust to a lifestyle of being locked down. And there was a lot of panic buying. And then it started to kind of level out in those regions as people established rhythms. And some people kept grocery delivery up. Some people had problems with it, especially with the lack of supply. And others kind of started going to the store in a more careful way. So that's kind of looking at the US and EMEA, where we have seen steady growth and penetration. Australia and Japan are a little bit different. So Australia and Japan, Australia really didn't have a strong initial peak, and the traffic has kind of petered out. Japan kind of had a much more subdued peak, and we're starting to see traffic slowly increase, which I think is really exciting in some ways, because Japanese society has traditionally been a little bit reticent to pick up on some kind of technological, I guess, not necessarily innovations, but ways of kind of acquiring products. So e-commerce, grocery delivery, etc. So the fact that it is starting to trend upward could signal a wider cultural shift. And speaking of e-commerce, we're seeing that the traffic data varies a lot between the main markets, and most are experiencing steady growth, but we do have areas like Hong Kong or France where we've had just a complete decrease. And I think that part of that is that we're seeing the economic impacts of this virus, and people are a little bit hesitant to spend, or maybe have unfortunately been laid off, so they don't have as many means for discretionary spending. So I think e-commerce is kind of the one industry that there's a lot of question marks around, because a lot of that is going to depend on how comfortable consumers feel about kind of discretionary spending, like I said earlier. So then in terms of some innovations that are kind of coming out of this crisis, one thing that I wanted to look at was contact tracing apps. So these apps, a lot of countries are making them. South Korea has had a really, has been a really strong example and has had really good kind of impacts from them. But I wanted to look at Singapore, because they recently, or at the end of March, they made Trace Together, which is a government app, and residents can voluntarily download it for contact tracing. In order for it to be effective, one news source that I was reading said that Bloomberg said that they would have to have 3/4 of Singapore's population would have to have the app on their smartphones. So I looked at the install penetration, which shows the amount of devices in the defined market that actually have the app installed. And this is the Google Play Store. And it looks like we've kind of been steadily increasing, but it still hasn't hit 10%. So it's very below that 75% mark, obviously. But I think that as the situation becomes more serious and there have been developments in that region, we could see more of the population starting to download the app. Singaporeans have traditionally been very trusting of the government. So I think that that is also kind of something that would give a little bit of more hope to this app. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of happens in the next few months. We are seeing that downloads also started to pick up kind of towards the end of April. Like I said, we've had further COVID developments in Singapore. And I think that we're going to see these apps appearing everywhere. I know Apple and Google have an effort in the US to make similar types of apps. And Australia recently launched COVID Safe on Sunday. So we could be seeing these types of apps happening all over the world. Another innovation, we have seen kind of an increase in the proliferation of adoption of robots for different things that maybe it would be safer than having humans do, right? So grocery delivery or things like that. And in Japan, we actually saw that SoftBankRobotics.com had a 720% increase year over year. So we are really seeing that this is an innovation that I think has always been or has been increasing a lot in traffic and in kind of curiosity over the past year, but it really could be fast-tracked by this crisis. Similarly, in Japan also, we are seeing the increased adoption of e-signature services, which is pretty out of the ordinary. Japan has a really strong regulations around seals. They have a seal culture. So a lot of documents have to be signed in person, and they call it hanko. So what we're seeing is that this increase for signature apps, especially DocuSign, which had a 74% increase in traffic between February and March, or all of them had a 74% increase in traffic, but DocuSign increased 168% in the last 3 months. We're seeing that with those increases, we can expect that I think the digital landscape in Japan and in all of APAC is going to change pretty dynamically. And that kind of leads us to our main hypothesis, really, which is that the world is going to be forever changed by coronavirus, and it's going to be forever more digital. And we want to be partners to all of you to make sure that we can provide you with strategies to really remain relevant, but also optimize your business online. So we are going to shift gears a bit and talk about Japan, which is a country that has been impacted in very unique ways. So for anyone listening in who is not from Japan or not in Japan, the situation in Japan is very unique. While big events have been impacted, obviously the Olympics were postponed, overall shifts to daily life have actually happened more gradually than in the rest of the world. So we've seen region level lockdowns, but we haven't seen an official countrywide lockdown. And there's actions that have been taken by Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. And I apologize in advance if I do pronounce things incorrectly. I'm trying my best. But we have seen that schools were closed down on February 27th. And then on April 7th, a few cities declared states of emergencies, including Tokyo. And then on April 16th, there was a nationwide state of emergency. However, state of emergency is different from lockdown. So Japanese people do have a little bit more freedom of movement. Hokkaido, unfortunately, recently went on lockdown again. I think I spoke to that earlier, but essentially they did an uptick in cases after lifting lockdowns. And I think that overall, the next few weeks are going to be really, really telling for Japan, especially. So where you have a similar agenda to Jamie, I'm going to start off with travel and tourism and what the effects have been in that space. And I think there's kind of some surprising data there. And then I want to go into the impact in Japanese society of telework or work from home. We're definitely seeing an increase in work from home, and Japanese society has traditionally not been as kind of allowing of work from home practices. And then we are going to talk about beauty and personal care and opportunities in that space. So first I wanted to look at Japan on a country level, and I wanted to see bookings done by people in Japan. And similarly to Australia, we saw a 36% decrease in bookings year over year for hotels. But that being said, that's a pretty low number, like Jamie said, compared to worldwide decreases. So the worldwide year over year decrease was 55%. And many regions were hit much harder. So really we're seeing that although there was a relatively steep decrease between January and March, it's not as steep as in other countries. And I think that as we get into this part of the presentation, what we're going to see is that although travel within the country hasn't been affected as strongly, tourism has been affected, and we're going to see how that was impacted, especially with the Cherry Blossom Festival and Golden Week being in the past month, and then this month, we're going to see, I think, further declines in the next few weeks. So as I was saying, there is, I think, a propensity for traveling in country for Japanese travelers. So we're seeing that in terms of destinations, we have seen that more Japanese travelers or the percentage of Japanese travelers that are traveling in Japan has increased, but really not an insane amount. So it's about 12%. So the majority of Japanese travelers were traveling in country in March 2019, and an even higher share obviously has been traveling in country in March 2020. And we can expect that this trend will continue and that people will favor domestic travel for the near-term future, and that domestic travel in most regions will pick up before international travel because consumers are more comfortable with it, because there's more necessity for it. But I think the more important or interesting part will be seeing what that small percentage that does like traveling internationally ends up doing. So will they still go out and travel? Will they travel domestically? What I think will happen to this pie, and how big or how small will it get? So that's going to be really interesting to look at. And we're going to do another poll. So after Tokyo, what was the second largest travel destination in March? And the choices are Osaka, Kyoto, and Hokkaido. So I'm curious to hear what you think. This is counting all travelers, not just Japanese travelers, so foreign travelers as well. So it'll be interesting to see your responses. Great, so it looks like Osaka narrowly won. And actually, we are seeing that you are right. Osaka is the top destination after Tokyo. So good job, everyone. But really with Similarweb data, it's amazing. We're able to see bookings at a destination level, and we're able to see who is booking where and how many people are booking where. So I want to start off on the left side. We have two pie charts here, and we're seeing that where visitors are from in terms of people who are booking trips in Tokyo. And in March 2019, it was roughly an even split between international visitors and then in-country visitors. In March 2020, we're now seeing that 3 out of every 4 bookings in Tokyo are now made in Japan. So that, I think, is a pretty drastic change, and really shows how the impacts on tourism to Japan have been a lot stronger than the impacts on in-country travel. And then on the right side, we are seeing that we can kind of do a deeper dive into the impacts on specific cities, and we're seeing that Tokyo, Osaka, and Hokkaido had a 60% average decline in bookings year over year, whereas Kyoto's decline was actually only about 36%. So that's kind of surprising and leads me to believe that the Japanese population might be going to Kyoto as a way to kind of get away. But Hokkaido, I expect to see even further decreases, especially with the recent lockdowns. Turning our attention to flights, so moving away from hotels, we looked at line of business traffic, so flights traffic on major travel providers. And what we're seeing here is that there's obviously been declines as a result of more people traveling domestically. There's going to be, traffic is going to decrease, but it's been a really slow moving process. And Japan really hasn't been as reactionary as in other countries. So for context, if you were to look at this same chart for the US, you would see a really intense spike in visits right after President Trump gave his first address banning visitors from Europe on March 12th. And that increase would have been due to people getting refunds or canceling their flights, and then almost an equal steep decrease in traffic. Whereas here we see some peaks, especially in January for All Nippon, and I believe that those were due more to winter specials or deals on flights than anything else. But really we're seeing decreases that are pretty sustained and not just super intense. And I think that that's a great sign for the country in terms of its travel sector and kind of what it's going to look like when it picks back up. But it also is a little bit worrisome because we haven't bottomed out yet. And I wonder if we're going to bottom out in the next few weeks. And then another segment that I looked at was car rentals. And across the board, so looking at this chart, I think it's a little bit complicated, but essentially what we're showing is year-over-year change in overall traffic to car rental platforms. And then we're comparing those for different periods. So we have January, February, March, the first half of April, and then the most recent data that we have for April. And essentially what we're seeing is that almost every car rental provider had really steep decreases from January through April, except for a few exceptions. And the most notable of those would be Coreco, which offers car sharing services. And it had a 21% year-over-year growth on average before April. In April, traffic started decreasing. I think consumers are starting to stay home more on their own volition, especially I think with the state of emergency happening. But before that happened, we were seeing people using car sharing instead of car rental. So I think that this kind of speaks to a larger trend of what could happen in the car rental space, or a few larger trends. So one of those trends could be that car sharing becomes more popular with Japanese consumers. And then another trend that we've seen kind of across the board is that car rentals were pretty much the last to fall off in terms of ways to travel, especially with people traveling more domestically. So we expect car rentals to pick up a lot more quickly than hotels and flights. I think flights will probably be the last sector to regain traffic again, just because of the impacts on them. So now we're going to talk about telework. And as I alluded to earlier, we know that traditionally it's not really in Japanese nature to work from home, and it has been a tough transition, but we are seeing that the transition is happening. So when you look at the search volume for keywords related to the phrase, what does telework mean? That search volume actually tripled between February and March, and it's now a top keyword in Japan. So we looked at the paid search traffic trend, and we see that Box, which is a cloud computing service, is capturing 36% of the traffic share. If you were to look at the organic search traffic trend, it looks very similar, but the players are a little bit different. Japan Telework Association gets most of the traffic there, and they have information on different government grants and services that companies can use to adapt to teleworking. So really making content around this is a smart move for any company, because as businesses transition to teleworking models, they're going to need different supplies or services. And if you can provide that, then you're going to want to make good content to bring people in. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But essentially, I think this is part of the larger transition in Japanese working styles, where we're going to see people become more comfortable working from home and hopefully just using more digital resources in general. Obviously, Japan is a very technologically forward country, but there's kind of this there's this dichotomy where people are less willing to use e-commerce platforms and things like that. That being said, we see that the top 3 players that were gaining traffic from the teleworking keywords that we showed before all increased traffic significantly. So we've already talked about Box. It increased traffic 26% month over month. KDDI, which is a telecommunications company, they increased traffic 768%, which is absolutely insane. And most of the organic keyword searches on their site have to do with 5G, but also they have a lot of searches for different products that they offer, as well as the Line Business Chat application, which allows businesses to communicate more efficiently online. And then we also looked at Sanwa, which is a B2B and B2C electronics retailer, as well as other equipment for offices. And we saw a 12% increase there month over month. And in terms of what Sanwa is selling or what consumers are interested in, we're seeing that consumers, the top 5 search terms for Sanwa, organic search terms, almost all had to do with USBs. Or USB cables. So on the right, you see Sanwa's page for USBs. And I think that this is a really awesome example of rich content because they have multiple pictures of their products. They have information or a lot of different kind of words to build around this organic landing page for USBs. And overall, I think that this is really helping to propel their strategy and increase their traffic. And it's a smart strategy for them to be kind of capitalizing on USBs. For some more context here, USB or this keyword was the top one of the top keywords on Amazon and on Rakuten for on-site search. It was actually the third most visited on-site search term for Amazon in the past month. So I think thinking about what consumers need while they're at home is really important, and being able to provide that and build content around that is going to really propel your brand. So we have another poll here. And I know we're kind of running close to time, but we'll quickly go through this one. And the poll is, what industry had the most traffic growth between February and March in Japan? And the answers are between beauty and personal care, beverages, or live streaming. Great. So live streaming looks like it won, followed by beauty and personal care. And I think you guys are all going to be in for a surprise because we've actually seen that beverages had the most significant increases out of those three industries in Japan. So for some context here, I actually read a story where an employee was talking about how his boss wouldn't let him work from home because he was afraid that his employees would be drinking if they worked from home. And I wonder if this kind of gives some ammunition to that boss, but also I think it just speaks to a larger trend of Japanese consumers starting to look online for products that they need. So obviously these are not transactional sites, but they all, except for Sapporo, increased traffic month over month, with Suntory increasing traffic 46%. And we're really seeing that there's just going to be, I think, a huge digital transformation in Japan on all levels. And I think that beverages as a category is showing that more than anyone else. And looking at a specific example of a smaller player that is kind of using a creative marketing tactic to gain share. So this distillery, Kikusui Shuzo, has been making 77 proof alcohol, which is obviously very, very strong alcohol. I personally do not think I could drink that. But they've been branding it as quote unquote, not hand sanitizer. And the reason for this is that in a lot of other countries, distilleries have actually shifted production to make hand sanitizer. However, in Japan, there are specific regulations preventing the same thing from happening. So in an effort to fast track things and fill a very distinct market need, because obviously hand sanitizer is, the supply and demand has kind of been a little bit insane, we are seeing that this distillery made the 77 proof alcohol to kind of fill that market need, and they've increased traffic almost 6 times during the launch. And I think that this was just such a creative strategy. If you look at the actual product label, we see that it says it is a sake that can remove bacteria from cooking utensils. And then if you go to the top 5 organic search terms on Kikusui shop.jp, we see that they all are related to alcohol 77, which is the product. Now, I know we are kind of about to run over time, so I want to quickly get through the next few slides, and I hope that everyone can stay on for the Q&A, but if not, we will have a recording after this. Great, so just a few more slides in beauty and personal care. And surprisingly, I think what we're seeing in that space is that the top websites actually had a 7% month over month increase in traffic. And we're seeing that kind of worldwide, which I think is due to a lot of promotions and things like that. But in Japan, it has been especially prevalent. And we are kind of heading into the back to school season, but I think it's interesting to look at what sites are gaining a lot of traffic. So we see that Hot Pepper and Salon Board are two of the top websites. Those are both beauty appointment booking sites. I think that it's interesting that they haven't really had a fall off because people are staying inside. So I wonder if some of that traffic is from people going to cancel their reservations, but I also think that because of the more lax restrictions in Japan, people are still using beauty booking sites. That being said, one of the top keywords on Hot Pepper had to do with hair catalog, and that keyword increased traffic 69% month over month. So I wonder if people are doing their own hair at home and using those catalogs as a guide. We actually saw an on-site search increase for haircutting scissors on Amazon and Walmart in the US. And Jamie and I both recently cut our own hair at home, which is why we're not showing our faces, but I can tell you that I know a lot of people who have been doing the same thing. So it seems like a huge consumer trend. And then in terms of organic traffic share trend for that keyword, we have seen it kind of start to increase. So then I looked at the term for foundation and the keyword group, and we see that between February and March, the traffic trend did decrease a little bit, with Amazon having the highest share. But if we look at the keyword for acne medicine, we saw a steep increase for paid traffic, and that was led by Proactive. So we'll talk about this kind of in the next slide, what their specific strategy was, but essentially they've kind of led a really successful digital campaign to target specific needs of their consumers. And the anti-acne market is a huge market, and Asia Pacific is actually expected to kind of lead that market because it is such a large consumer of exports, especially from the US, and Japan is one of the largest. So Proactive, I think, is set up really well. And what they've done is they were able to achieve the most traffic that they've had in a year through a student discount and back to school promotion. And essentially, student discount and junior high school student discount are two of the top terms from the past 28 days on proactive.jp. But we're also just seeing that they have kind of built, or they worked with partners. So this was an affiliate site that kind of put out a notification about the back to school sale. And looking deeper into their marketing channel, we're seeing that Proactive kind of worked to build their presence in Japan. So in March 2019, they were trying a variety of different marketing channels and kind of relying on referrals and display ads alongside organic search and direct search. And I think that early on, by trying these different channels and by building their brand that way, they were able to have a 164% increase in direct traffic year over year. And now they mostly rely on direct traffic, which is amazing. That's free traffic, with a decent amount of emails. We saw that March 20 and February 2020 had an uptick in email channels for Proactive. And I'm guessing that those were all emails with promotions. So we see that early investment in different marketing channels can really reduce costs down the line. And one interesting promotion that Proactive is putting out right now is an antivirus support set. So this is a limited time only set that comes with a mask, a case, and a handkerchief. And they have a banner on their website kind of promoting it. But I think that the key takeaway here is that creative strategies are going to win, especially as the world kind of grapples with changing to a more digitally focused way of living. So to summarize, we've seen much more extreme external tourism effects for Japan than effects on travel inside of the country. The shift to telework has been kind of monumental for the society, and it's changed product needs and general consumption habits. And for both travel and for telework, I expect to see significant changes in the next few weeks. And then creativity in the beauty and personal care space goes far. And back to school has definitely opened up the door for many opportunities. Even though schools are shut down, people are still buying into products, especially skincare products, because I think that people are less inclined to buy into cosmetics like foundation, as we saw, since they're not going out as much. But people still, I think, want to keep up their personal care. And I would expect to see a trend towards personal care, towards clean beauty in the next few weeks and months.